Good morning. It is great to spend this moment with you, and we're going to be spending it as we have the past few weeks in the book of Hebrews, if you'd like to get out a Bible and be turning there. First of all, I do want to echo what others have said in wishing a happy Mother's Day to all of you mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers and also mother figures to so many of us in our church family. There's no doubt that this is certainly a different Mother's Day than we might have expected at the beginning of the year. But I hope that you are all still finding some creative ways to honor the mothers and mother figures in your life in spite of all that's going on. I did want to mention that our church office is hopefully providing at least one small way to do that. You may have received in your mailbox this past week one of these or a couple of these postcards. They're pre-stamped and ready for you, and these are just a simple way that you could fill out and send out a word of encouragement to a godly woman in your life who's blessed your life this Mother's Day. And maybe this sermon also might give us an opportunity to reflect on some of those women and mother figures in our lives that we might wish to encourage and honor. So that's one way that you can continue to honor our mothers and mother figures around this time of year. You know, I actually heard of several husbands and children who are just taking it a whole step further in the way that they're honoring the women in their household in a pretty dramatic way this year in order to spend more time with their spouses and mothers. Some husbands and children have actually sworn off watching sports all month this month. And talk about a sacrifice. Now, I remember growing up, it would have been quite strange to spend even 3 days not watching sports on our television at our home growing up. It would have seemed very different. Our first story this morning that I want to share with you actually comes from the sports world, and that might seem like a strange place to start on this Mother's Day, even though, as I say that, I realize that the Amber Owenses and Rachel Katie's of our church are probably bigger Cowboys fans than I am, and there's many more like them as well. But it might seem like a strange beginning to begin in the sports world on Mother's Day. But the sports world is actually where our passage is leading us. If you're familiar with Hebrews 11, and if you were listening in the verses we just read from Hebrews 12, this passage culminates in this race with many spectators. This passage is leading us into this faith-filled stadium with a great cloud of witnesses on hand. So it seems fitting to start in the sports world. And besides that, the sports world is actually filled, believe it or not, with a lot of really powerful examples of a mother's love for their families. For example, I want to share with you a story from just 2 weeks ago about this athlete and his mother. It came about during the NFL draft this year. So every year, the National Football League has this draft day, which is a day when a lot of college football players and their family, their dreams, their lifelong dreams, this is the day when that becomes a reality. And of course, under normal circumstances, that moment when the dream becomes a reality is announced before a stadium filled with applause. But this year, of course, it was announced on video, remotely, just like everything else going on in our world. But that did not stop this young man, big Tristan Wirfs of Iowa, from doing something special for his mother on that day. Some of you may have seen this. In the front yard of his house in small-town Iowa, Tristan Wirfs literally rolled out the red carpet for his mother to walk on draft night, just like she would have at that big event in New York if it had taken place like normal. And it was a small gesture, but it's the least I could do for my mom. And he actually said the focus really ought to be on her today and not on me. Some newspaper articles have picked up Tristan Wirfs' story, and it seems like that's a fair thing to say. From where his life began in a trailer park home with a single mother and grandmother and sisters all living in that one space, to this day when his dream came true, all Tristan Wirfs could say about this is that none of this would have happened without my mom. So he tells the story about how she got her first job at Target at age 16, and she kept working at it. For 28 years, she worked at that Target as she climbed up higher and higher to be a manager of that store. And she worked countless extra hours on weekend and countless extra hours closing shop just so she would be off and available to go to every single one of her son's football games. She did the little things. She searched the internet for size 17 cleats and actually found some, believe it or not. She did the big things. She made sacrifices. And her son noticed this. This is what her son said on draft night about his mother. As a kid, you don't notice all those things that your mother does for you. But as I got older, I figured it out. And I didn't want to let her sacrifice go to waste. It became a big part of the motivation for me in sports. I love her more than she knows, and getting to hopefully pay that back to her someday would mean a lot. And I really liked that story, and I loved that quote, because to me, it reminds us of what so many of us see in our mothers and grandmothers and mother figures that makes them so special to us. That is the willingness of our mothers to make loving sacrifices for our children, for their families. And sometimes it's just, frankly, astounding what many are willing to do. What many are willing to give for the ones they love. And more than just astounding, it's also, to use Tristan's words here, it's motivating. His quote was, "I don't want to let her sacrifices go to waste." And that became a big part of the motivation for me in doing what I do. What I hear him saying is that her loving sacrifices, they affected me. They had an effect on me. It stirred up in me this desire to do my best and to live differently. And that is, at the heart of it, what I think Hebrews 11 has been leading us toward all along. Today we're wrapping up this mini-series within our Hebrews series, Faith Lessons from Faith Heroes. And I have quite intentionally saved these verses for today as we think about the faith heroes we remember on Mother's Day every year. Because the end of Hebrews 11 and the start of Hebrews 12 teaches us this lesson about loving, motivating sacrifice that I think just goes so well with what so many of us have seen in our moms and in our mother figures. The kind of sacrifice that touches us, motivates us, and changes us. So let me just set this into context really quickly. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about faith and direction, how faith directs our steps toward God, and that without faith it's impossible to please God, but with faith, like Abraham and Sarah and Noah before us, it is actually possible to draw near to God, and faith is what enables that. Faith directs our steps toward God. Last week we talked about faith and connection. How faith not only directs us, but also connects us to God and also to this long line of faithful people who have gone before us. People like Moses and Moses' parents, and Joseph and Jacob and Isaac before them. There's this long line of laborers in the field, and we are all connected by faith as we work together for the same reward. These are the kinds of things we've been learning about faith along the way. And then as we get to the end of the chapter, the appeal that it makes, the message, the way that it's calling us to change It builds on all of that, but now we're moving out of the historical Abraham, Isaacs, and Jacobs, and now we're seeing something that is really emotional, really personal. What we see here now are people and their sacrifices. What we see at this point are people who lay down their lives for God and those they love. We are stepping out of the Old Testament story now. We're stepping into a world that for those very first readers of Hebrews might have been closer to home. And it's here where the message really starts aiming at our hearts and calling us to change. So yes, faith directs us, and yes, faith connects us. But today, what we want to talk about is how faith affects us. And that's, of course, another word for changes us. But that particular word affects us. It comes from our English word for affection. What we're talking about today is the kind of change that is stirred up and motivated in our hearts. So the question is, how does faith affect us? Like, how does it stir up our hearts and change us? How does it motivate us? And the answer that Hebrews gives to that question is that faith affects change in us through sacrifice and through all of those people who lay down their lives by faith. Let me show you what I mean. We're going to begin today in verse 32. It's where we left off last week. And this is after the great historical sweep from Noah to Abraham to Sarah to Moses and all of those that we've gone through in this chapter. And now we get to the point where the writer says, look, what more shall I say? I could go on and on about all of those who we know from Scripture, who we know from history. Time would fail me, verse 32, to tell of Gideon or Barak or Samson or Jephthah or David and Samuel and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, who were made strong out of weakness, who became mighty in war, who put foreign armies to flight. Like, he's really putting together quite a list here. I could say so much more. And then pay special attention to what he does next. Verse 35. Who are we talking about now? Women received back from their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. Some were stoned, some were sawn in two, some were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth. And I want to draw special attention to those verses we just read here, 35, 36, 37, 38. What is it that you find striking about what we see here? Who is it that Hebrews is drawing attention to here? Feels like we've kind of stepped into some new territory in these verses. Totally gone now are those familiar names from the Old Testament. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah. We don't hear about any of them in these verses. Now we have the stories of other faithful ones. Anonymous faithful ones. We don't read their names, not in this passage of Scripture. And yet what they have done by faith is anything but anonymous. Because what they have done in faith is lay down their lives. The common thread, which unites all of these people that we read about in these final verses of Hebrews 11, is the fact that they have given up their life. Some in suffering, some to mocking, some to flogging, torture, chains, imprisonment, swords and saws, stoning, affliction, and wandering. Like the variations on it go in 1,000 directions. But the common thread that unites all of these people is that these are the stories of people who were willing, by faith, to lay down their lives in obedience to God and in search of His promises. And I just have to think, as I read these anonymous stories of faith, that these must have been all the more personal to those first readers of this letter, the first readers of Hebrews. I think there's a couple of reasons to believe so. First of all, like I said earlier, we're moving out of the Old Testament now. Now we're moving closer to home. We're moving closer to their own time, maybe into their own time. Some of the things we read about faithful ones here that we don't know their names, we don't read any stories that look like that in the Old Testament either. So what the writer is giving us here is things that either happened between the Old and New Testament, and I think there's some of that, or things that happen now. Like in the world that the readers of this letter are living in now, to Christians. Things they're going through. This is hitting closer to home. This is personal. In the New Testament, of course, we read about Christians whose names we do know, who go through some of these same things. James the Apostle was killed by the sword. Paul, of course, very famously suffers mocking and flogging and chains of imprisonment, but he's not alone in that. Silas, for one, is right there with him in most of that. And then there are many more. And those, of course, are just two examples. But what I want to say is that to the Christians who read Hebrews and hear these words for the first time, this is personal. Them. They're hitting close to home. Because after all, and this is the other reason why, these very people are going through their own struggles as well. The passage directly before, and this is no accident, the passage directly before the great heroes of faith is where we learn about this group of people that Hebrews is written to, their own struggles. Recall that in former days, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with suffering, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those who are so treated. And it is with this struggle in mind that these words are written. Don't throw away your confidence. We have a great reward we're striving for, so don't give up. You have need for endurance so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. So in other words, the letter has just finished saying, I know you've had your struggles, church, but you need endurance and you need not to give up. And then on the heels of that is when we have this great passage of faith, because this passage of faith is written to stir up courage, to stir up endurance. It's written to stir up our hearts and motivate us. It's written so that faith might affect us, so that it might change us. Hebrews wants to build up that confidence and courage in us, and to do that, it tells the stories of those who have laid down their lives. It changes us through the examples of those who lay down their lives. Faith affects us through that kind of loving sacrifice. We as people are not so different than that football player I introduced you to a moment ago. How once he realized the great sacrifices his mother had made for him, once he realized the costly gift of what she had given for him, the things she had given up, he said, look, I don't want to let that go to waste. That motivates me to be the best I possibly can be. It stirred up in him the courage to give it his all and to really compete well. And that's what this passage is trying to do in us too. Faith affects us. It stirs us up to courage and to our best effort when we see those who are living it, sacrificially living it in their lives. And that is one of the biggest reasons why all of you mothers and grandmothers and mother figures matter to us and matter to the church and matter to what God is accomplishing in the world so very much. This is one of the reasons, because so many of you, by faith, lay down your life, your time, your effort, your wants, and in a way that motivates all of us. You set the example for how to be faithful through the way that you're living. And the same goes for all of our church mothers too. I have a lot of church mothers. It's the ones who teach Bible class, it's the ones who encourage our young people, it's the ones who set the example and do all the things we see and sometimes don't see in faith and life and in love and in purity to build up God's church, to take care of us. Those efforts are not wasted and they're never lost. Because when those things are done in faith, it gives faith the chance to do what it does best. And that's touch our hearts and motivate us to give it our all. Faith affects us through people who lay down their lives, through the examples of those who give what they have to give for the sake of Christ. And so, the passage concludes with these words, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So you see what this part of the passage is doing, right? You see what it's trying to say to us. It's saying, now that you've seen all those who by faith have gone before you, now that you've seen those who by faith have laid down their lives, now is the time when that faith affects you, when it changes you. Now is the time for you to be motivated and run with all that you've got, so that their sacrifice does its work in you. What Hebrews has done for us is it's filled the stadium with this faithful crowd, all those who motivate us, this cloud of witnesses that verse 1 talks about. One thing I find interesting is that word there for witnesses in Greek is the word martus. It is the Greek word that forms our English word martyr. And throughout Christian history, that word witness will be the one that is used for those who literally become martyrs and lay down their lives sacrificially in obedience to God in a way that changed the world. All of those who lay down their lives are gathered in this great motivating crowd to say to all of us, run the race as best you can. Run with endurance the race that's set before you. Set aside sin and the things that hold you back, and run. Let your hearts be stirred up by the faith of those who cheer you on for you. And most of all, we look to Jesus, verse 2, who is the founder and perfecter of our faith, the pioneer of our faith, and who, just like many others, but more so, for the joy set before him, laid down his life, endured the cross, despising its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So what is the lesson for us today? What's the takeaway? How is faith going to affect us? Well, I'll give you two thoughts. First, for those of us who want to be changed, if we're looking to work on our faith, if we're looking to grow, I can think of no better place to start than to look to those who are setting the example by laying down their lives. Because when we look to those who are laying down their lives, it's going to motivate us to give what we've got. Now, of course, by looking to those who lay down their lives, that's going to bring Jesus to the center stage in our hearts and in our minds. Jesus, of course, showed us how to have the same mind in us as he had in himself when he looked not to his own interests, but humbled himself, emptied himself, took on the cross. But it's not just Jesus who helps us here. I would encourage you also to look around, for there are many people in this church, many people in our families perhaps, many mothers and grandmothers who are showing us the example and motivating the change by laying down their lives. So if you want to be changed, I would say start there. And the second point is like that. If you want to be one who makes a difference, who helps to make a change in others, then what more important place is there to start than striving to be that example of one who lays down their lives? Strive to be the kind of person who gives their time, their gifts, their resources, their efforts in sacrificial love for others. Because those kind of things have the power to change many lives. It's the kind of thing we learn and see from mothers and grandmothers, mother figures. It's the kind of thing that allows all of us, perhaps, to take our place in the great cloud of witnesses, motivating one another on to pursue Christ and the joy that's set before us. Maybe today, for you in your life, what you need to do is lay down your life in baptism for Christ, because when we are baptized in his name, it is as if we are laying down our old life of sin, being raised up in life anew. Maybe what you need today is to look to and honor those who have laid down their life for you. And the best way to honor them is by following in their footsteps. Maybe today you need to be motivated that you can help be part of the thing that changes lives when you give your life in service to Christ. However we may be called or challenged, let's reflect on this great opportunity that is before us as we sing this song of encouragement.